Hello and welcome back to another build video here on Rockler. In this video you're going to watch me build this station. It is a mobile on wheels station to move around printing equipment and a printer that will go on top. And I had to adhere to a few different guidelines, the depth, the width, the height on some of the drawers for specific printing equipment. And what you're watching me do here is rip MDF with a cherry veneer. And if you notice what I do, I rip it just a little bit wider than I need it, and then I come back in and cut off the factory edge. I flip it so I have a fresh cut on both sides. And don't get mad at me for painting cherry veneer black. It was a decision my friend made after we built it, and actually you'll see some nice tones in the end. And just using my my track saw to do my cross cuts. Just being very specific and very methodical. And there's a lot of very simple but specific cuts I need to make. I gotta subtract the width of the material, subtract the width of the height of the wheels that are ultimately going to be put on the bottom. And so I'm just focusing and trying to concentrate on all the various different widths and lengths and heights that I need to be aware of. And this is all going to be attached together with a system that Rockler makes called the Beadlock system, and you'll see that in just a minute. And now, going through all my material, I realized I have a couple pieces left over. No reason to cut a full piece that's going to be the top, so that's what you see me doing, using the beadlocks to attach two pieces that are going to become the top of the cabinet area, but not the top of the countertop. If you'll see what I mean in just a minute. This beadlock system works. You use this, you shift it, and then you drill it again. So you end up drilling 5 holes that overlap one another, and then you'll see the pegs that go in and attach the two different sides together. And I tried it also on the short side, so you'll see what I mean in just a minute. So those are the beadlocks that are going in there, and they're supplied by Rockler. And again, this is just joining two pieces of material that are otherwise too skinny to use anywhere else in the project, but this keeps me from having to cut into a full new sheet of plywood. As a matter of fact, I didn't even really need to use the cherry plywood for this part, or this MDF for this part, because it's going to be completely hidden up inside. But anyway, I had it and I used it just also to keep everything the same density. And it's a little bit more detail about what I'm doing. You move it over and you overlap the holes. So ultimately you have 5 holes that overlap, and you take your biscuits and you put them in there. And I needed to do some short parts on the side, so I just cut them in half just to get some better yield out of it. And you'll see what I mean. I glue them in here, and then I drilled a very short set of pockets on the side of the material, and that's just reset my ring up, my stopper ring on the drill bit head there, to get it to go just a little bit shallower. And now this is a interior, so I couldn't technically put a screw through it without it showing, which there's nothing wrong with that if you do it tastefully and you do it consistently. But here what I'm doing is I'm hiding all the joining, hiding all the joinery in there. And you can see that's on the short side is what is the bottom, and it's tucking into what is the side. And just using my long bar clamps to pull everything together. And you'll notice I'm moving that clamp around to get everything pushed into place. I'm just using some dry sawdust to get rid of the glue. And these are just some shop steel angle irons I have. I've had them for a very long time, actually. They're a little sentimental. I use them for doing right angle stuff. And there you see me just putting up the other side. And it's a bit finicky, but once you get it, you get it. I haven't done cabinet work in a really long time, so this was a little bit kind of getting back in the saddle for me. And you'll notice this is a little method of working alone. You see I just have those ledges clamped up there, and then I use that piece of wood in the middle there to extend the usability of those shorter clamps. And now this is going to be the middle. One side's going to be shelves, the opposite side's going to be drawers. And I'm using that as my spacer. You can see I wrote the word spacer on it, and I use that in all 4 points: the front, the back, the bottom front, and the bottom back. And you'll notice I didn't use glue here. I'm just using screws, because trying to get glue in that joint is very messy. You could potentially swipe it all over everything, and then you'll only notice it later when you go to try and put a finish on it. So in certain spots where I think glue is just going to become a total mess, I try to leave it out totally. And you'll notice I put a screw in the front and a screw in the back and then a line across them. Obviously I could place the one in the front and the one in the back easily because I could see right at the edge. And so by now I've already drawn a line up that just to make sure that I get it. So that's looking up at the bottom of the cabinet, and just putting some 2.5-inch screws in there to keep everything tight. And I glued these in place just to keep them from wiggling, because when you have a cabinet and you put screws in it, just rummaging around on rough floors, tile floors for instance, could potentially loosen. So just to keep the vibration down, I just put a little PL glue on the bottoms of the wheels. And now this is actually hardwood. This is hard cherry wood, and I'm building a skirt. I certainly didn't want to build the skirt out of MDF because this is going to take some abuse. It might go over a door threshold or two throughout the house. I want to make sure that this can take some abuse. So this is going to be the closest to the ground. This is a trick I do. I need an overall width of 26, and the other side of the ruler shows me I only need to put a piece of 24 between those two sides. So that's a quick way of doing the math. That was a little quick. Hopefully you understood what I meant. And here I'm just using the Kreg jig. This is an old Kreg jig I've had for many years. It might be one of the first generations of Kreg jig. That's how old it is, but it still works really well. And a lot of people, badmouth Kreg jigs. I think they're great. It's a great way to get a screw where you otherwise would have a very difficult time getting it there. And when you're making money and you're doing cabinetry work to make money, I don't think there's anything wrong with it. When you're retired and you have plenty of time to play around and do all kinds of joinery, it's a different story. And you'll notice my cat, I just had to shoo him out of the way. And here, I'm putting some pocket screws in there, and then you see all the available pocket screws to go up underneath this cabinet. And again, this is going to be the hardwood skirt that places the floor the closest to the floor. And now here you see this is going to go around the wheels. And I clamp everything first. It's glued and clamped. And also the hardwood gives the entire unit structure. It gives it sort of like an I-beam structure at the very bottom. Because this is going to be heavy. If I was trying to just count on that bottom sheet alone, that is just MDF along that screw line, it might even break in half. Who knows? It's going to ultimately develop a lot of weight. And again, these are sort of I-beam style. That's hardwood, just to keep the top from drooping. So it's part style, part structure. It's a little bit of both. And again, that's actual hardwood. That's not MDF. And now I'm making edge banding. I like to make edge banding all at least 1/8 of an inch and a few thousandths wider than the board that it's going on. And I had to make a little bit of a technical decision here to make this edge banding on the edge of that MDF right there, but also create a few steps. And I was very conscious of what I was doing here. So you'll notice that reveal at the top is set back 1/8 of an inch, and the edge banding everywhere is going to bring everything out 1/8 of an inch. And I wanted hardwood around the bottom as well, all the way around the bottom, because just like the skirt, I knew it would take some abuse, and so I put some hard edge banding around the entire bottom. Here you can see, and that's how I trim it. Always back the cut when you're going to use a little handsaw. Using the pull saw, always back the cut, you get a clean cut. And this is obviously several days with all the glue drying in between all different cuts. And so now I was just a touch proud, and I used my trim router, always climb cut that, because you don't want a conventional cut and you'll get a rip out. Always climb cut whenever you're doing that sort of small edge banding. Now I just have my sanding block, and it's important to have a sanding block with a naked side and sandpaper on two sides. That naked side helps you get inside corners. And now here I'm doing the math to break up my area for the drawers. And I just lay it out on a piece of tape, and then I bring it over there, and that's how I do all my math, typically. And that becomes my story stick, that piece of tape. And now here I'm beginning the construction of the drawers in 1/2-inch Baltic birch plywood. And there is going to be 4 slim drawers and 2 fat drawers. And I made a couple of mistakes while I was working on these drawers, but nothing that I couldn't recover from. You know, this is the ultimate test when you build something like this, is how to hide your mistakes. And I certainly did make a few, again, because I was rusty. It's been a long time since I built cabinets and drawers, a long time, maybe 4 years. Now I'm just making all my parts, and of course the saw stop sled is unbelievably handy for this, with the movable stopper there. You see the little metal thing at the bottom of the screen. And I'm doing this sort of self-made lock. I maybe somebody in the comments could tell me what this is called, but this is a little lock you could make up yourself on the table saw. And this is where I made one of my mistakes. I made the lock so that it shows on the side. I really should have made the lock so it gets completely buried under the facade of the drawer, and then also goes into the back so you don't see it. But that's just a minor mistake. Once I realized I made the mistake, I decided to live with it rather than cut everything over, because it's very wasteful. It's just a very small detail, which you might not even see in the rest of the video. Honestly, I can't remember. But now here you see me making part of the lock. And so this is 1/2. So these are all the drawer fronts and backs. Again, I should have had these in the opposite direction. I should have had that cut on the sides. Anyway, you'll see in a minute what I'm talking about. And so you cut all these for all the parallel facing drawers, and now just do something slightly different for the other facing drawers. Now you'll notice I have a piece of wood there. That is the width of the blade. So I trimmed all my pieces, and then I stick that in there. So you end up with that nice little lock. And the reason I put that little piece of wood in there is because here I trim everything to the right width. Everything gets trimmed to the right width. And I didn't want to change the setting, so I'm flipping each piece. They were all rough cut, by the way, until I fine-tuned my cut. So that's why the height of the blade is set. And then I put that little spacer in on the stopper, and it moves everything over a blade's width. And now I'm assembling everything with glue. And I let everything dry. Make sure it's squared up while it's sitting there and drying. It's obviously very important. And this is just there's 2 of these size drawers, so this is just another angle of the same assembly. And it's great to have these long clamps, especially when you're doing drawers. You want to make sure everything's pulling together tight, nicely and tight. Checking my square, of course. Oh, tighten up my clamp. And now these are the smaller ones. They all go together the same exact way. And put glue everywhere. And you got to be careful. You want squeeze out, but you don't want squeeze out that's going to become a total mess. You got to keep a wet rag. And at this point, it was still late February, so it was pretty cold in my shop. I didn't want to get my hands wet, so I was being real careful. And then if I did have any squeeze out, I used some dry sawdust. Now it's probably the next day, and I'm sanding everything, making sure all my joints are nice and flat and clean. And you notice that piece of wood I have hanging off the table gives me a good opportunity to work on various parts of the drawer without having it be too high. I could put it down at waist height, or I can keep it up at eye height. And I decided to put some small thin screws in all the parts that get hidden under the face frame. So there's screws that face the back inside the drawer cavity and face the front behind the face of the drawer. Now here I'm putting a rabbet in the bottom with just this small little trim router. Creates a ton of sawdust, but I also it's a lot to cut, so I'm doing it in stages. I'm doing it, and then I'm lowering it, then I'm doing it, and then I'm lowering it down to a 1/2 inch. Again, because this drawer is going to be used for photo equipment and heavy print paper, I want all these drawers to be fully 1/2 inch in every direction, which is why I'm gluing and nailing and screwing everything. I want to make sure that these stay together. Certain drawers can take a lot of abuse, and they could potentially fall apart. And I think I also put screws where you couldn't see, again, under the front and facing the back. And you'll notice I was using a shim. I wrap a shim around a wet towel to get into those tight joints. And now I'm just using some water-based general finish. I laid everything in there with spacers, and then I took those spacers out, and now I'm drawing the lines. I thought I had a little clip of video of me putting them in, but that everything was just laid in there with spacers in between them. And now I'm using my Rockler installation jig. Helps keep you square to the front of your cabinet, and you always get 2 in there. And everything's set back far enough for the drawer, and then also to accept the draw face, which is going to be inset, not overset. Rather overlaid, is going to be inset. And these are full extensions. These are kind of really more utilitarian and less more cosmetic. They're more utilitarian because the drawers are going to be used for business, and not just going to be like hair curlers and stuff. There's going to be print paper, printing ink and such in there. And so now I have the draw slides are pulled out. This is how I typically do this. I have a spacer under the drawer, and then I pull the drawer out and I put a second screw in. So I always get the front, and then I put a second screw in, and so then I begin to adjust everything. So now that drawer is in with a spacer under it, and now I lay the other drawer above it. Now that drawer is laid above it with 2 spacers underneath it, and then I work my way all the way up. It's a little unconventional, but it's always worked for me. In fact, I don't know how anybody else does it. I know people probably don't do anything like me because I'm a little wacky. And then I just move that spacer up, and then I go up. And to be perfectly honest, these drawers gave me a little bit of a hassle, and I had to reset them. Not because of this method, just because I made the drawers all a little too tall. I had no space between the drawers pulling in and out and the face frame. So before I committed to putting the faces on the drawers, I made all the drawers about a 1/2 inch lower. So you see how tight they are together there? In another take, you'll notice they're a little bit closer. They're a little bit further apart. The gaps are a little bigger. And that's because I took every drawer and I cut off about a 1/2 inch off the top of each one. Off camera, of course. And so now I'm laying out 3/4 inch MDF with cherry veneer. These are going to be the drawers. And there's my trick where I always get rid of the factory edge that's been banged around and its travels. So now these are the top 4 drawers. And there you see the top 4, and then these are the next 2. These are 9 inches. Those are 4, 4, 4, and 9 and 9. 4, 4, 4, 4, 9, 9. And now I'm doing my edge banding, and this is just an economy of time and just putting edge banding all along the short sides together. And once it dries, I will then saw it apart and then put edge banding on all the long sides. So now here it's a couple hours later, and I'm just using my little flush cut saw to cut everything apart quickly. And then I will get in there and sand everything nice and flush. And once I sand everything nice and flush, then I put all the long sides. And then when it comes to what goes over what, because I'm lap joining every edge, I consider where your eye is. Since you're going to be looking down at these drawer edges, or these drawer faces, I make sure the long side covers the 2 short sides. It's just a small little thing, and I could also do a 45 joint at every corner, but obviously that's fairly tedious. And what you see me doing here is just smoothing everything out, getting prepped, making sure all the edge banding on all the short sides is flush with the side of the MDF to accept it. And like I said, you want to look down, you want all your last piece covering your previous open ends, if that makes sense. Now I'm just laying out all the long side edge banding. I'm gluing everything, and then I'm putting in a pin nail. Pin nails are so tiny you can just barely see them, but it keeps everything from slipping around when you try and clamp it all up. And now we jump through time, and here I am sanding those raised edge bands that are on every side of the draw face. Now I'm placing the draw faces, and you'll notice I'm using hot glue. I put a couple of dollops of hot glue on my draw face, and I get it to fit right where I want it with the spacers and everything in place, and this way they stay there while I'm putting more screws in it. So now the placement is right. The screws keep them in place forever, and then if I need to adjust anything, I could stick a shim in there, open it up, close it back up with the tightening of the screw, so I could adjust the placement of the draw face in relationship to the frame and relationship to the drawer above or below it by just tightening up any one of those 4 screws or loosening them up. But the hot glue gets me there. Now I'm putting in my shelf pins, and I'm using the Rockler shelf pin jig. And I'm not a big fan of shelf pins. I think people will just put them where they want them, and then that's it. Very rarely do you see people adjust anything down the road. But for that reason, I did not want to put every single shelf pin in. So you'll notice I taped over every other hole, and that was important, because even though you think you're paying attention, you'll forget and you'll drill out of sequence. And now I'm just fitting the shelves. Everything's looking good. I made the shelves off camera. They were a little redundant. And there's my last shelf with all adjustable pins. Now this is the little backer that goes inside behind the drawers, and my friend who I made this for needed exactly full 24 inches inside the drawer, so this ultimately is about 27 inches, maybe just a little under 27 inches overall, and I had to account for that little 1/8 inch reveal. So you'll see how that reveal I've carried through to that insert in the back. And now this is the cherry veneer top, and I had a piece of 1/4 inch MDF that I glued to the bottom, which happens to have a walnut veneer on it, but I wanted to build the top up a little bit. I'm using the same stock that I built the whole cabinet out of, but I wanted it to be just a little bit thicker, and I didn't want to simply just put a thick edge on it. I wanted the whole thing to feel thicker, so I glued a 1/4 inch onto it. And now I'm doing the edge banding, and I'm just showing the short sides. But since this is front and center, I only taped the edge banding on. I didn't nail it, meaning that it's going to be subject to scrutiny. And so at this point, I got a call from Adam, who said he wanted to stain it black to match a couple pieces in the house. So I'm using this black gel stain, which doesn't make it completely black. It's not like a black dye. You will see some notes and tones of the wood underneath all of this. And I did some tests off camera, and I realized I had to let this dry for a day, but if I used an oil-based polyurethane on top of it, it would reactivate the black and give you brush strokes. So I had to at least do 1 spray coat, which you'll see me do in a minute. I have to do 1 spray coat to lock in the black with 1 layer of polyurethane. So you'll see me do that in a minute, but it's important to keep the strokes straight up and down to try and stay in there with the grain. Let it soak in, and then I wipe it off, and then I let it dry for a day. It's the first time I've ever used this stain. It's in the Rockler catalog, and it worked really good. It worked really good. Like I said, you just have to be careful that you don't reactivate it with your brushing on a new coat of clear, for instance. So here, this is the poly that I used, and I shot this on a GoPro, and I just wanted to give it 1 coat. I'm not very good at spraying, and I don't have the optimal space to spray in, but I just gave it 1 quick coat just to lock in the black. And then once I let this dry for a day, I came back in and I sanded it with 320, and then I brushed the next 3 layers with sanding in between. So again, this was just to lock in the black, because if I did not do this, it would be moving the paint around with the brush. You see how I was able to just hit the drawers by just blocking and blocking. And another time and place, I probably should have painted the draw faces, but we thought we were just going to polyurethane it earlier on, so I thought it was going to be easy. I didn't realize we were going to actually paint it black. And now here I am at my full spectrum laser, and my buddy is a photographer, and he has these old-timey patent drawings which are in the public domain, and he suggested I use them somehow, some way. And so I did 3 generations of camera patent drawings etched into the veneer, and it leaves a burn mark, so you sand the burn mark off. And then using the polyurethane, I brushed it on. 3 coats of polyurethane with like a 220 in between. And it gave me a really beautiful finish. And just working that paint in there. Again, this is the sealer coat. I sanded this, painted it the next day, and then sanded that second coat, and then painted it one more third time. And it gives me a really nice finish I feel like I could trust. And everything also, once everything is said and done, everything gets rubbed down with like a 600 grit, which barely does anything. It just breaks that little tiny fuzz that you might feel in the paint. Now here we are. The cabinet's been brush painted and sanded about 4 times on top of that spray coat, using a 1-inch screw to keep that top in place. You'll see I'm using my Rockler screw clamp just to keep it in place. I'm placing my dust drawer back in there. Now this is putting the handles on. This is an old trick which you've probably seen on this channel a few times. Mark each corner with the width of your part, and then, does that make sense? You mark each corner and then you crisscross all those lines, and you end up with the exact screw holes directly in the center there. Now this was a failed draw face that I am using as I sanded through the veneer. That's why I considered it a fail. So I made another one, but now I'm using it as my guide to place the handles. The pulls are from Rockler.com. They're beautiful silver finish handles. And the screws all have little segments. If you'll notice, the screws that hold the pulls have segments. So I just had to sand off one segment, and the threads start again. You could even probably break it off with a pair of pliers, but since I had the grinder, I used the grinder. And so here we are. This took about 5 weeks of on and off work, only because I've been so busy. So Rockler, thank you for being patient with me, and thank you for the opportunity. And to my friend Adam, thank you for challenging me with something that I typically don't do too much anymore. It reminded me how difficult something as simple as this can actually be. And thank you for listening along. I hope you learned something. Thank you, Rockler.